My mother taught me one basic hard and fast rule. No matter how intricate the plan, no matter how many fail-safes, no matter how well supported a plan was, some idiot would come by and ruin it all without ever knowing your plan existed. Diary entry: The Devil's Daughter. If you aren't willing to defend yourself, what impetus does another have to defend you? Philosopher Flesh, branded by the malevolent universe. Cult of the Maimed One. My brothers taught me a simple fact, one they had seen play out over and over again in their thousands of years of strange lives. History is a series of tragedies built upon the bloody bones and shredded meat of the dead. Anyone who believes otherwise is foolish enough to put a grenade in their mouth and pull the pin. Diary entry: The Devil's Daughter. The Ch.30 were a fairly large species for the Cygosaurian galactic spur, standing at nearly 2 meters tall. They were thin and frail appearing, weighing in at only 60 kilograms, with a T-shaped head and face, the mouth in the lower section full of chewing teeth, with 3 eyes, one at the bridge of the face, one on each side, giving them nearly 270-degree vision. Their skin was dark yellow, streaked with lighter patches at almost random. They had hair down the back to their head, neck, and spine to the top of where their 2 long 4-jointed legs joined their torso. They had 2 arms with 4 joints with a wide degree of mobility. Like the majority of species, the Ch.30 had muscles that pulled and pushed as well as twisted. They were endothermic, regulating their body temperature through exhalation via the 6 slits on either side of their wide necks. The back of their heads here conical to hold their brain tissue, the same brain that let them quickly climb to the top of their homeworld's food chain. They were omnivores, but preferred to be herbivore with meat for additional protein. They were intelligent, quickly adapting to tool use. Agriculture came first, then metalworking. Eventually domestication of animals replaced eliminating the competition for food. It took them thousands of years of dominate the planet as the sun went from reddish to an orange color. Their progression was steady, set back here and there by natural disasters, through various technologies. The war between science and theology lasted for generations, but ended with science triumphant. Afterwards came complex politics, until the Ch.30 had a complex governmental system around various industries controlling parts of the government, with CEOs and CEOs of each industry being voted upon by the board of directors of the massive corporations, which were ranked by profit, popularity, and usability. Wars were set aside as not bringing profit, as wasting resources. Population control came right afterwards, enforced stringently. The Ch.30 built cities, sailed their oceans, explored their wilderness, all the while looking to the stars and to the 2 moons that orbited Narvoka's gift, their planet named after their most powerful divine figure from their early years. Despite scientists insisting on renaming the planet, the powerful industries in charge of the government refused. Their culture, their government, their way of life was built on the bedrock of history. History was not to be rewritten, just as a corporation's history and a product's history could not be rewritten. That which could be rewritten was not to be trusted. So they looked at the 2 moons, each named after 2 lesser divine beings, a pair of twins, one male, one female. Satellites went up first. One's to look down, one's to look outward, one's to pass on transmissions, others to analyze the weather. Finally, they made manned orbit. Then they built a space station. Then, finally, with much fanfare, they landed on the slightly larger of the moons, planning on exploring the 2 moons around their planet with their crude craft. It was there they discovered that they were not alone in the universe. The moon's dust hid wreckage. It had long been argued whether or not all of the visible craters on the 2 moons were natural. Many insisted that they had been placed there by the gods as decorations. Later, scientists claimed that the craters were from impacts, but it did not explain some of the craters. There were strange patterns in the dust that early telescope exploration proved that the gods had decorated the 2 moons. Now the answer was obvious as the lunar explorers swept away the dust. Bipedal armor. Armor for creatures with 4 legs and 2 arms. Armor for creatures with 4 legs and 4 arms. Armor for creatures with 4 arms and 2 legs. Armor that looked like insects. Great metal vehicles that were obviously designed for combat. Giant bipedal robots. Spaceship wreckage. That was shock enough to the Ch.30's culture. It was when the remains of dark violet bipedal creatures with feeding tentacles covering their mouths, 3 wide white eyes, and long sensitive fingers were discovered. It hit like a bomb. After all, those creatures were listed as the emissaries of the gods in the earliest religious writings. Despite the screeching of scientists of the research industry, religion came back with a fervor. They were just an advanced race, the scientists yelled. They created us, ruled over us, gave us commandments, and protected us, was the answer. They were no different than we are. They were mortal, not divine. We have the bodies to prove it, the scientists said, shaking the photostats of the beings. They existed. They elevated us from common animals, was the roar back from the crowd. They were not gods, merely creatures like us, the scientists screamed. Blasphemy, came the return scream. The defense industry section of the government found themselves having to stop the masses from hanging the research industry. The communications industry advocated for the religious industry to be formed so that the religious would have a voice in the government. The scientists grumbled but were reminded that the 2 moons were a wealth of knowledge waiting to be discovered, and without the transportation industry and the computing industry, the research and science industries had no chance of reaching the 2 moons. They were sulky about it, but accepted that they had suffered a temporary setback as far as power and influence went. Relics were brought back by the transportation industry and handed over to the historical industry, the educational industry, the research industry, and the scientific industry for examination. Arguments quickly broke out over one industry or the other monopolizing the artifacts. As with every other time accusations of monopolization had occurred, the argument was taken directly to the justice industry. After 2 short years, the justice industry made their decisions that all other industries would abide by. It was a shock wave. It was determined that all artifacts would be turned over to the theology industry for safekeeping, and they would determine who would be able to examine the artifact and in what order and for how long. The science and research industries feared that the theological industry would deprioritize their requests. Instead, they were startled to discover that they were put on priority, with overtures to jointly study with the theology industry in order to discover the wonders of the divine Narvoka's universe. The Ch.30 examined the artifacts brought back, encouraging the transportation industry to retrieve more. It quickly became obvious that not only had the fighting raged on the 2 moons, but looking down, knowing that 2 forces had been locked in combat, the strange patterning of the lakes and minor seas that had always defied scientific explanation suddenly made sense. They were scars from that titanic struggle. Careful examination proved another fact, that the sun's beginning to change from red to orange had coincided with the approximate end of that struggle. It had taken thousands of years for that to accomplish, but the start, based on estimations via the thickness of lunar dust, was roughly at the same time as the sun had begun to brighten and Narvoka had begun to decorate the heavens with the glittering jewels of the night sky stars. Another fact was revealed. Despite the mute testimony the wreckage provided of the savagery of the combat, despite the vehicles and spacecraft left behind on the surface of the moons, there was no evidence of what fought that servants of Narvoka. No remains, no armors, just vehicles, some weapons, destroyed or heavily damaged spacecraft. Just the remains of the servants of Narvoka and a half-dozen other species that there was no record of in the fossil record. The defense industry found itself working hard to examine the patterns of wreckage to determine what had happened. A third party, not the servants of Narvoka nor the Ch.30, had fought the servants and obviously come out triumphant. The defense industry determined that the third party had recovered all the remains and the smaller war materials, leaving behind only the largest and most heavily damaged. Whatever it was signified by the common logo of a 5-digit grasping extremity crushing a planet in its grasp. The Ch.30 remembered, dimly, that logo. How it was to be feared. There was no archaeological sign of that sigil, but it was frighteningly familiar to the Ch.30. Remains of the servants of Narvoka were brought to the surface of Narvoka's gift. At first, research was simple. Then, things changed. Researchers and scientists began bringing gifts to the desiccated remains of the purple bipeds to try to please them. They confided in the corpses. Then they refused to allow them to be examined to the point that the enforcers of the justice industry had to use force to regain the corpses. It was determined that somehow the corpses were the cause. Just the sight of the corpses for extended periods of time brought about a desire to please the corpse. Research had also determined that the servants of Narvoka used crystals heavily in their weaponry, vehicles, and many other applications. The crystals were all dark and dim in the wreckage. They were brought back to be examined in the vain hope that their purpose could be determined. Months followed without a breakthrough. However, after extended exposure to the Ch.30, the crystals began to glow. Twice weapons fired. Once a vehicle powered up, lifting up off the ground. Research could not explain it. It was not exposure to living creatures. Rude animals had no effect. But the Ch.30 did. Intelligent thought caused the change. That led to a joint subsidiary project named Sci-Research Industry. Bit by bit, the Ch.30 explored the wreckage, as well as their stellar system. More wreckage was found, on every planet, in wide orbits around the stellar mass. Still, no hint of who the servants of Narvoka had fought beyond that logo on the damaged vehicles. The vehicles and spacecraft had all suffered damage, not only from the combat, but from security charges going off, destroying what must have been vital or important equipment, in some cases obviously computer equipment. While the research into the wreckage led to the advance of science in leaps and bounds, it also led to the theological industry gaining more and more power. Every household had icons of the servants of Narvoka. The students of the education industry learned about the servants of Narvoka. Many industries knew that their power and influence depended on learning more of the technology of the servants of Narvoka. There was many things that made no sense. Often vehicles, and even the remains of beings were found that were absolutely identical, as if they had copied at a molecular level. There were places where timepieces fell out of sync with timepieces outside of the area. There were areas where researchers and archaeologists and recovery specialists reported suffering headaches and slight visual and audio hallucinations. The Ch.30 explored their stellar system over the course of several centuries, eagerly searching out artifacts and relics of the struggle that had marked every planet in their stellar system. Ships were found in high orbits around the gas giants, all of them destroyed and heavily damaged. The evidence was obvious. The servants of Narvoka came from beyond the Narvoka system. Their foes were from beyond the Narvoka system. The question was asked, could the servants had survived? If so, why had they never returned? While the education industry had no answer, and the research industry could not come up with an answer, one thing was obvious. The Ch.30 would have to be careful leaving their stellar system. The nearest exosystem was 4.2 light-years. Examination of wreckage had shown that it was possible to move at faster than light, despite what the Ch.30 had believed prior to discovering the wreckage. It took nearly 2 centuries, but finally they were able to build, test, and perfect a faster-than-light engine. The most difficult part was realizing that it was impossible to come out of FTL space too far into the stellar gravity well without being destroyed. Finally, the Ch.30 managed to reach the nearest system. There, they found blasted worlds still recovering. Mute evidence of fighting everywhere. More vessels of the servants of Narvoka. Still nothing on the great enemy that had obviously been why the Ch.30 had been ejected from paradise and the presence of Narvoka. Sure, there was wreckage, and that terrible sigil and the other runes that caused fear. The pointed yellow oval with a diagonal black line and an animal head on it caused nervous fluting through their breathing slits just gazing at it. It was usually found on aerospace assets and heavily armored vehicles. They explored nearly a dozen systems. They found either nothing or the wreckage of that titanic struggle. Evidence showed that it had encompassed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of years. Evidence meticulously gathered showed that every time, the fierce combat led to the sun going from red to orange or yellow. In one's case, the sun brightened to a bluish-white. Some speculated that the great enemy wanted the stellar masses like that because they fed on the increased solar radiation. Centuries passed until finally something was found. In a stellar system less than 50 light-years from Narvoka's gift and the Narvoka system, a different ruin was found, a planet. The world was pockmarked with silent scars of atomic detonations. The atmosphere was harsh and unrelenting, the weather savage and forceful. The only life was primitive, fungal and lichens, with protoplasm oozes and simple multicellular life. Ruins were spotted by the survey expedition that were different than any other. Large walled facilities that jutted out of the sandstone and volcanic ash-fused rock, covered with lichen. Probes showed unusual vehicles, strange shapes under the ash and lichen. Debate was fast and furious. Could this be the great enemy? Had the great enemy been defeated here? It was decided. The Ch.30 would send a flotilla to the system with experts and archaeologists. The defense industry insisted that they be allowed to commit to the OVA project. 5 years after its discovery, the Ch.30 flotilla arrived in the system. They moved to orbit the planet and sent down personnel to create a base to operate from. The archaeologists were eager. The personnel from the research industry were eager. At last, answers would be found. Who was the great enemy? And did they still exist? Did the servants of Narvoka still exist? If so, where were they? The Ch.30 did not know. But, now, they might be able to find out the answers. With that in mind, they sent a team to examine the smallest of the sites. The universe liked that.